The nightmare always began with the same suffocating silence. In the darkness of his mind, Matteo Caruso stood in a sterile hospital ward, staring at the woman he had discarded 2 years ago. In this haunting vision, a child would open his eyes the color of a storm, the unmistakable mark of the Caruso bloodline. "That child isn't mine," he would roar in his dream, tossing a check like garbage before the door slammed shut. It was a scene of betrayal that played on loop every night, a ghost of a truth he was too proud to face. If this story's already got you hooked, smash that like button and let me know you're here. Share this with someone who loves a good drama, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what happens next. Because trust me, this is just the beginning, and the secrets buried in the Caruso bloodline are darker than you can imagine. Matteo woke with a gasp, sweat soaking his silk sheets as the hospital vision faded into the shadows of his bedroom. For 2 long years, he had tried to convince himself that Sienna Blake was just a scammer, yet the uncertainty gnawed at him like a predator. He didn't know if the child in his dreams even existed, or if he had truly sent his own blood into the cold New York night. To understand the shadow haunting the city's most dangerous man, we must go back to the beginning, to the girl with no name, and the mistake that changed everything. But Sienna Blake wasn't always the woman lying in a hospital bed with her son in her arms. She had once been a child nobody wanted, a name on paperwork passed from one house to another like a broken object. Her mother died giving birth to her, and no one knew who her father was. Perhaps her mother didn't know either. Or perhaps she did, and carried that secret to the grave. Sienna entered New York's foster care system when she was only 3 days old, a tiny life wrapped in a hospital blanket, and placed into the arms of the first stranger, in a long chain of strangers who would raise her without ever loving her. The first family returned her after 8 months because they said she cried too much. The second family kept her for 2 years until they had a biological child and no longer had room for a foundling. The third family was where she learned that silence was the only way to survive, when the man of the house drank every night, and the woman pretended not to hear the children crying. She drifted through 7 families over 18 years, 7 houses where none was home, 7 beds that never belonged to her, 7 times packing her entire life into a black plastic bag and climbing into a social worker's car with a face that no longer knew how to cry. She learned to read by teaching herself in public libraries because no one bothered to check her homework. She learned to cook because if she didn't cook for herself, there would be nothing to eat. She learned how to become invisible because invisible children didn't get beaten. Her 18th birthday came with no cake, no candles, no wishes, only a social worker whose name she couldn't remember handing her a paper to sign and a bag containing $200, along with a list of homeless shelters. The system had raised her for 18 years, and the system pushed her out in 18 minutes, the office door closing behind her as Sienna Blake stood on a New York sidewalk with everything she owned in her hands, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do, knowing only that she wouldn't die on these streets. She slept in the first shelter for 2 weeks before being thrown out after fighting with a woman who tried to steal her shoes. She slept on subway trains until the police chased her away. She slept in Central Park on summer nights and shivered in the corner of bus stations on winter nights. She did every job an 18-year-old girl without qualifications could do, washing dishes in a Chinatown Chinese restaurant 12 hours a day for wages that couldn't cover rent, cleaning rooms in cheap motels where she learned not to look at what guests left behind, working in bars where men looked at her like meat, and she learned how to smile while wanting to scream. She survived not because she was strong in the way people like to say, but because she had no choice except to survive. Because if she died, no one would even remember she had existed, and Sienna Blake refused to disappear from this world without leaving a trace. That desperate resilience was what led her to the gates of the Caruso mansion in the winter of her 25th year, where fate was waiting for her in the form of the most dangerous man in New York. The job at the Caruso mansion came to Sienna through a woman named Rosa, whom she met during a night shift at an Italian restaurant in Little Italy. Rosa was a sous chef who had worked for the Caruso family for 20 years, and she told Sienna they needed a new housemaid because the previous girl had quit, suddenly without anyone knowing why, and the pay was 3 times higher than any job Sienna had ever held. She didn't ask why the pay was so high. She didn't ask why the girl before her had left in the middle of nowhere. She only knew that the money could help her rent a real room, instead of sleeping in shelters, and that was enough for her to nod yes. On the first day she stepped into the Caruso estate in Westchester County, she understood why silence was paid so generously. The property stretched across 12 acres of perfectly trimmed lawns. Walls over 3 meters high surrounded the entire grounds. Security cameras watched every corner, and men in black suits stood guard 24 hours a day. Men she quickly learned she should never look in the eye. Inside the mansion was a level of luxury she had never imagined. Polished black marble floors, crystal chandeliers hanging from soaring ceilings, artwork she guessed was worth more than her entire lifetime of labor, and a heavy silence that pressed down everywhere, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rosa led her around and quietly explained the unwritten rules that no one ever wrote down but everyone had to know. Never speak to the boss unless spoken to. Never look the boss in the eye. Never ask about the boss's work. Never stay in a room when the boss enters. Never mention anything heard or seen inside this house. And most importantly, learn how to become invisible, because the best servants are the ones the boss never remembers seeing. Sienna met Matteo Caruso for the first time on the afternoon of her third day. She was wiping the glass doors in the living room when he walked in with two men, one of whom she would later learn was Bruno Vitelli, his right hand. She lowered her head and stepped back into the corner as Rosa had taught her. But in the split second before she looked down, she saw him. Matteo Caruso was over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back black hair and gray eyes like a storm ready to break. Eyes she would never forget. Those eyes passed over her the way they would pass over a piece of furniture, without pausing, without acknowledging her presence. And Sienna understood that to this man, she truly didn't exist. In the weeks that followed, she learned the rhythm of the house and of its master. She knew he woke at 6 every morning and drank black coffee without sugar. She knew he liked his ties arranged by color from dark to light. She knew he hated noise and despised delay. She knew he never smiled and never said thank you. She also knew other things she pretended not to know. The late-night meetings behind closed doors. The men who arrived with tight faces and left pale and shaken. The bloodstains on the garage floor she had to scrub away before dawn without asking why. The distant gunshots at night she had to pretend she didn't hear. Sienna Blake had survived 25 years by becoming invisible. And inside the Caruso mansion, she perfected that art so completely that even her shadow seemed to leave no trace. But she didn't know that a pair of storm-gray eyes had begun to see her, even if the man they belonged to hadn't realized it yet. Sienna had been working at the Caruso mansion for nearly 3 months when New Year's Eve arrived that year, and it was the night she would remember until her final breath, the night everything changed in ways she could never have imagined. The mansion filled with guests from the afternoon onward, men in expensive suits, and women glittering with diamonds. Politicians, businessmen, faces she recognized from the news, and faces she knew better than to recognize at all. Sienna moved like a shadow through that lavish crowd, carrying trays of champagne from room to room, clearing empty glasses, wiping spilled liquor, and pretending not to hear conversations about money, power, and darker things she didn't want to know. The clock struck midnight amid cheers and fireworks exploding across the sky, and Sienna stood alone in a kitchen corner looking out the window, wondering whether this new year would bring anything different to her life, or whether she would continue to exist like a ghost in someone else's house forever. Guests began to leave after 1 in the morning, and by 3 the mansion was nearly empty, leaving behind a heavy silence and the mess the staff had to clear before dawn. Sienna was mopping the living room floor when Bruno Vitelli appeared in the doorway and told her in a flat voice that the boss needed someone to bring more liquor to his office, and since she was the only one left on this floor, she had to go. She didn't ask why. She had learned that asking why in this house was dangerous. She simply nodded, took a bottle of whiskey from the bar, and walked toward the oak door leading into Matteo Caruso's office. She knocked twice and heard a low voice from inside, granting permission, and when she pushed the door open, she saw him sitting there in the darkness, only the firelight from the fireplace illuminating his face, a bottle of whiskey more than half empty on the desk, and a glass in his hand. Matteo Caruso looked at her with a piercing gaze she had never seen before. Not cold, not threatening, not empty, but something else entirely. Something almost desperate, almost lonely, almost human. He gestured for her to set the bottle on the desk, and she did. But when she turned to leave, his voice rose from the shadows and told her to sit down. She stood there for a second, then another, unsure what to do. But it was an order, not a request. And she had learned that no one refused Matteo Caruso's orders. So she sat in the chair opposite him, back straight, hands clenched in her skirt, heart pounding as if it might break free. He said nothing for a long time, only watched her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he took a sip of whiskey and asked in a rough voice whether she knew what day it was. She answered that it was the first day of the new year, and he laughed, a laugh without warmth, and said that was true. But it was also the day his father had been shot dead 7 years earlier, right in this room, on the very chair he was sitting in. Sienna didn't know what to say, so she said nothing at all, and perhaps that was the right thing, because Matteo continued as if he had held these words inside for far too long, and they were spilling out against his will. He spoke of the loneliness of power, of having everything and nothing, of how everyone around him either feared him or wanted something from him, but no one truly stood beside him, of building an empire with blood and tears and having no one to share it with. She sat there and listened, not because she had to, but because she realized that beneath the ruthless exterior of the most dangerous man in New York was another orphaned child, a child who had lost his father and never learned how to live with that pain. He stood and stepped closer to her, and she knew she should run. She knew this was wrong. She knew this was a line she was never meant to cross. But when he touched her cheek with trembling fingers and said she was the only person who looked at him like a human being instead of a monster, she didn't run. What happened afterward, in the glow of the firelight and the scent of whiskey and the loneliness of two lost souls finding each other in the dark, was something Sienna would never tell anyone, but she knew that night changed everything. That night planted a seed that 9 months later would become a child with storm-gray eyes, and that night set in motion a chain of events that would drag her from a false heaven down into real hell, and then lift her up again. The next morning, Sienna woke alone on the sofa in the office, her body aching. The cashmere blanket draped over her, the only proof that the night before hadn't been a dream, but Matteo Caruso was gone as if he had never been there at all. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. But when the first sunlight of the new day slipped through the window, she knew she had to get up, straighten her clothes, and return to being the invisible servant, as if nothing had happened. She saw Matteo that afternoon while she was clearing the dining table, and he walked in with Bruno, and she waited for a glance, a nod, some sign that he remembered the night before, but those gray eyes passed over her like empty air, cold and hollow, as if she didn't exist, as if she had never existed. Sienna understood then. She understood that the night before had only been a moment of weakness for a powerful man, and that the moment had passed. She understood that to Matteo Caruso she was still just a servant, a nobody, something that could be used and discarded without a second thought. She swallowed the pain and kept folding his clothes, kept cleaning his floors, kept living like a shadow in his house, because she was Sienna Blake, the orphan who had survived 7 foster families and freezing nights on the streets of New York, and she wouldn't let any man break her no matter how powerful he was. 6 weeks passed in that heavy silence, 6 weeks during which Matteo never looked at her once, never spoke a word to her, and she began to believe she could forget that New Year's Eve like a bad dream, until the 43rd morning when she vomited in the bathroom and realized her period was 2 weeks late. She bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy 20 miles from the mansion so no one would recognize her, and when 2 red lines appeared in the small servant's bathroom, Sienna sank onto the cold floor and cried, not because she was afraid, but because she knew her life had just changed in a way she couldn't control. She knew she had to tell him no matter how terrified she was, no matter how she feared his reaction, because the child inside her deserved for its father to know it existed. She waited 3 days to gather the courage, and one evening, when Matteo was walking alone from the garage to his office, she stopped him in the hallway, her hand shaking as she held the test result. He looked at her with the irritation of a man interrupted by something insignificant and asked what she wanted, and she held out the paper with trembling hands and said she was pregnant, that the baby was his, that she didn't know what to do. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Matteo Caruso laughed, a cold and cruel laugh, and asked if she was joking. She said she hadn't slept with anyone else, only that New Year's Eve, only him, and his expression shifted from irritation to danger, his steely stare turning to ice as his voice dropped to a threatening whisper. He said he didn't remember any night at all. He said she was a servant trying to cling to the Caruso family with her belly. He said she knew who he was and what he could do to people who stood in his way. Then he pulled out a pre-written check for $100,000 and threw it in her face like trash, and said the coldest 2 words she had ever heard. "Deal with it." She stood there with the check at her feet and tears streaming down her face and said she wouldn't kill her child. And Matteo stepped closer until his face was only inches from hers and said that if she didn't disappear within 24 hours, he would make her disappear, and no one would ever find her, and no one would remember she had ever existed. That night, Sienna Blake left the Caruso mansion with a small suitcase holding everything she owned, the $100,000 check she picked up but swore she would never cash, and a tiny life growing inside her. A life she had already decided she would protect at any cost, even with her own life. Sienna left the Caruso mansion at 3 a.m. with less than $800 in savings in her pocket. And she knew that money wouldn't last long in a city as expensive as New York, but she had nowhere else to go, no one to turn to, nothing except the baby growing inside her, and a determination to survive at any cost. She found a rundown studio apartment in the South Bronx, a part of the city people with money never set foot in. A single room with cracked walls, unreliable hot water, cockroaches crawling across the floor every night, and neighbors who were addicts, petty criminals, and other lost souls trying to survive on the edge of society. The rent consumed half of her savings, and she knew she had to find work immediately if she didn't want to end up back on the streets before her baby was even born. She found a waitressing job at a small neighborhood diner, minimum wage plus meager tips, but it was all a pregnant woman without qualifications could get. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing on swollen feet from morning until night, carrying heavy trays while her belly grew larger, while her back ached so badly she wanted to cry every time she bent down, while waves of nausea hit without warning, and she had to run to the bathroom to vomit, wipe her mouth, and return to serving customers with a forced smile. She had no health insurance, no money for regular prenatal care. All she could do was read books about pregnancy and childbirth in the public library, and pray that the baby inside her would be healthy, despite the conditions she was living in. By the 5th month, her feet were so swollen she couldn't wear shoes. She wrapped her ankles in bandages, and kept working because missing one day meant losing one day's pay, and she couldn't afford to lose even a single day. By the 6th month, she began to feel dizzy often, the world spinning whenever she stood up too fast, but she kept working because the baby needed her alive, needed her earning money, needed her not to collapse. In the 7th month, on a scorching August afternoon, Sienna was carrying a tray from the kitchen into the dining area when everything suddenly went dark. She collapsed in the middle of the restaurant, food crashing everywhere, and she lay unconscious on the filthy floor while customers screamed and someone called an ambulance. She woke up in a public hospital with an IV in her arm and a doctor telling her she was exhausted, malnourished, anemic, and that if she kept working like this, she would lose the baby. But when she returned to the diner, the owner told her she was fired because no one wanted an employee who could pass out at any moment, and she stood on the sidewalk with her final paycheck in her hand and no idea how she was supposed to keep going. She looked for other work, but no one hired a woman 7 months pregnant. No one wanted to pay someone who could give birth at any time, and her savings dwindled day by day while the rent waited for no one. In the 8th month, her landlord banged on her apartment door at midnight and told her she had 24 hours to pay 2 months of back rent or get out. And Sienna had no money, nowhere to go, no one to call. She packed the most important things into her small suitcase, walked out of that miserable apartment with her 8-month pregnant belly, and made her way to a women's homeless shelter in the Bronx. She slept on old bunk beds alongside other women life had pushed to the bottom. She cradled her pregnant belly every night and whispered apologies to the unborn child. Sorry she couldn't give her a better life. Sorry the baby had to begin life this way. And every night, in restless sleep on an unfamiliar bed, she dreamed of storm-gray eyes, the eyes of the man who had pushed her into this hell, and she woke with tears on her cheeks and a burning hatred in her heart. The shelter closed at 9 each night and didn't reopen until 6 in the morning, a rigid rule with no exceptions. And on a late September night, when Sienna arrived 15 minutes late after walking back from a free clinic on the far side of the city, she found the iron door locked tight, and no one answered, no matter how hard she pounded until her hands tore. A freezing rain began to fall around 10, the first flakes light as feathers, then thicker, colder, and Sienna curled on the bench outside the shelter with her 8.5-month pregnant belly, her thin coat useless against the biting New York autumn chill. She sat there shivering, lips turning blue, thinking that maybe tonight was her last night. Maybe she would die there on that frozen bench with the child who hadn't yet been born, and no one would know, no one would care. She would be just another nameless body found in the morning and buried among the unclaimed. Just then, when Sienna had nearly given up hope, a wrinkled hand touched her shoulder, and a warm voice rose through the falling snow. "My dear, you'll freeze to death if you sit here." Margaret O'Brien, 68 years old, an Irish-American widow with silver hair and kind blue eyes, was on her way home from a volunteer shift at church when she saw Sienna huddled in the snow. She had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she recognized immediately that the young woman was pregnant and in danger, and she couldn't walk past like others had. Sienna tried to refuse because she had learned not to trust anyone, but Maggie wouldn't take no for an answer. She said she wasn't asking whether Sienna wanted help. She was asking whether she wanted to live, and Sienna was too cold, too exhausted, too desperate to resist. Maggie's apartment was small but warm, filled with photos of a late husband and grandchildren who lived far away. And that night Sienna slept on the old sofa under a thick wool blanket. For the first time in months, she didn't shiver from cold. For the first time in years, she felt that someone truly cared. Maggie didn't ask about Sienna's past, didn't ask who the baby's father was, didn't ask why she was alone and homeless. She only said, "Everyone has their own story, and when you want to tell it, you will." For now, the most important thing was keeping mother and baby healthy. For the next 3 weeks, Sienna stayed in Maggie's apartment, eating proper meals for the first time in months, resting, being cared for, being seen as a human being rather than a burden. Then one night, as the rain lashed relentlessly against the window, Sienna woke to a tearing pain low in her belly and knew the baby was coming. Maggie called an ambulance and went with her to the public hospital, holding her hand through an 18-hour labor filled with pain and terror, when the doctor said the baby wasn't positioned correctly, when the heartbeat weakened, and they nearly rushed her into emergency surgery, when Sienna thought she would lose the baby or lose herself or both. But in the end, after 18 hours that felt endless, the baby's cry rang out, and they placed the tiny boy in Sienna's arms. She looked down at that red, wrinkled face, and the baby opened his eyes, and Sienna saw storm gray, Matteo Caruso's eyes, the eyes of the family that had cast her out like trash. She cried, not from pain, but from joy, from relief, because she had done it. She had brought this child into the world even when the world had tried to stop her. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Leo, your name is Leo, like a lion, strong and brave, everything your mother wants you to be." The next 2 years were a strange blend of hell and heaven, of hardship and joy, of exhaustion and a boundless love. Sienna had never known she was capable of feeling. After leaving the hospital, she and Leo moved into a small apartment. Maggie helped her rent in the same building, the rent slightly cheaper than where she had lived before, and more importantly, close to someone she could rely on when she needed help. She returned to work when Leo was 6 weeks old, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. She had no savings. Government assistance wasn't enough to survive on, and Matteo Caruso's $100,000 check still lay untouched in a drawer, never cashed, because she would rather starve than accept money from the man who had called her child a mistake to be dealt with. She worked 3 jobs just to make ends meet. From 4 in the morning until 7, she cleaned offices downtown. From 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, she waited tables in a small Bronx diner, and from 6 in the evening until 10 at night, she washed dishes in a restaurant 3 subway stops from home. Maggie watched Leo during the hours Sienna worked, and when Sienna tried to give her money in gratitude, Maggie refused and said the child had given her a reason to live, that after her husband died she thought loneliness would kill her, and that Leo was the grandson she had never had. Sienna slept an average of 4 hours a night, sometimes less when Leo cried from teething or illness. She lost 10 kilograms in the first year. Dark circles settled permanently under her eyes. Her hands grew rough from soap and dishwater. Yet every time she came home and saw Leo smile, all the exhaustion faded away. Leo grew up healthy and sweet. He learned to roll over at 4 months, to crawl at 7, to take his first unsteady steps at 11 months, and to say mama at 1 year old, a word that made Sienna sob right there in the kitchen while Maggie stood beside her smiling and wiping away tears. The baby had her black hair and her smile, but those eyes weren't hers, storm gray like a sky before a break. Matteo Caruso's eyes looking back at her every day from her son's angelic face. Some nights, as Sienna sat beside the crib watching Leo sleep, she brushed her fingers over his eyelids and wondered whether he had inherited his father's cruelty, whether those eyes carried the darkness of the Caruso bloodline. But then Leo would open his eyes and smile at her with the purest smile in the world, and she knew her son wasn't Matteo. Her son was Leo, her little lion, the only light in her darkened life. She hated Matteo Caruso with everything she had, hated him for using her and discarding her, hated him for denying his son, hated him for dragging her into hell. Yet she couldn't hate those eyes on her child's face. She could only love them with the fiercest love she had ever known. And in the long, sleepless nights, when the city lay silent, and only Leo's steady breathing filled the small room, Sienna wondered whether Matteo Caruso ever thought of her, whether he ever wondered about the child he had ordered to be dealt with, whether he knew that somewhere in this city a little boy with his eyes was growing up without a father. While Sienna struggled to survive in the South Bronx, on the other side of the city, inside the grand mansion in Westchester County, Matteo Caruso was fighting his own demons, even though he would never admit it to anyone. 2 years had passed since the night he had driven the pregnant woman out of his house with a $100,000 check and a threat to make her disappear. 2 years during which Matteo kept telling himself he had done the right thing, that she had only been a servant trying to scam him, that the baby wasn't his. Yet deep inside his mind, in the place reason couldn't control, doubts smoldered like embers that refused to die. Matteo began to suffer from insomnia about 6 months after Sienna left. Long nights spent staring at the ceiling of a king-size bed worth tens of thousands of dollars. Seeing her eyes looking back at him, not eyes filled with hatred, but with pain, the eyes of someone betrayed by the man she had trusted in her most vulnerable moment. Then the nightmares started. Dreams in which a baby with storm-gray eyes cried in the darkness and called for his father while Matteo couldn't reach him. Dreams in which Sienna lay frozen on the street, with her pregnant belly and blue lips. Dreams that left him waking with a scream trapped in his throat and sweat soaking his back. He started drinking more to forget, whiskey every night until the world blurred. But alcohol didn't help him forget. It only made the images sharper, more painful, more real. That change began to affect his work. Matteo Caruso, already ruthless, became violently unpredictable, ordering torture for minor mistakes, killing for reasons that once would have earned only a warning, exploding at subordinates over trivial errors. And the entire Caruso empire began to tremble under the instability of its boss. Franco Caruso, Matteo's younger brother, 32 years old, and forever living in his brother's shadow, was the first to see opportunity in the chaos. Franco began whispering to the underbosses in private meetings, saying Matteo was losing control, that he was driving the family toward destruction, that perhaps it was time for a new leader, someone who could make decisions with reason instead of blind rage. Those whispers spread through the Caruso empire like a virus, and although no one dared openly challenge Matteo yet, loyalty had begun to waver, eyes had begun to question, and Franco was patiently waiting for his moment. Gianna Caruso, 62 years old, widow of the former boss and mother of the 2 men now circling power, was the only one brave enough to confront Matteo about the change in him. She came to his office one night and found him sitting in the dark with an empty whiskey bottle, and she asked him directly what he was hiding from her, telling him that she had given birth to him, and she knew when something was haunting her son. Matteo didn't answer. He only looked at his mother with tired gray eyes and said it was nothing, that she didn't need to worry. But Gianna didn't believe him. She saw ghosts in her son's gaze. She saw guilt eating him from the inside, and she wondered what had happened 2 years earlier that her son had never spoken of. And Matteo, during those long sleepless nights, often found himself wondering where Sienna Blake was now, whether she was still alive, whether the baby had been born, or whether she had followed his order, and if the child had been born, what color its eyes were. That last question haunted him more than anything else, because deep in his heart he knew the answer. He just didn't dare to face it. The truth Matteo had tried to bury for 2 years finally found its way back to him, and it came in a way he never could have imagined, through the eyes of the man he trusted most. Bruno Vitelli, 40 years old, who had followed Matteo since they were boys running errands for his father, was assigned to investigate a small gang operating in the South Bronx without Caruso permission. It was a routine job, nothing remarkable, and Bruno was sitting in his car watching an alley when he saw her. Sienna Blake, thinner than she had been 2 years earlier, her hair tied high, revealing a gaunt face and dark circles under her eyes, was pushing a stroller along the sidewalk across the street. Bruno almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had once been a maid in the mansion had changed so much, but he remembered that face, remembered the night Matteo ordered him to deliver $100,000 and make sure she disappeared, and he wondered why she was here, in this slum, with a stroller. Then the child inside the stroller sat up and turned around. And Bruno Vitelli, a man who had witnessed countless deaths without blinking, felt his heart miss a beat. Those eyes, storm-gray eyes he had seen for 20 years serving the Caruso family, The eyes of his boss. The eyes of his boss's father before him. The eyes the entire New York underworld knew as the mark of Caruso blood. Bruno sat in his car for an hour, watching Sienna push the stroller into a crumbling building and disappear, and he knew he had to report this to Matteo, even though he didn't know how his boss would react. That night, Bruno stood in Matteo's office and told him what he had seen, and he watched his boss's face shift from indifference to shock, and then to something Bruno couldn't read, something caught between fear, hope, and despair. Matteo said nothing for 5 minutes. He just stared into nothingness. Then he gave the order in a hoarse voice. Investigate her. Everything. Every detail of her life over the past 2 years, and the child. Find out everything about the child. Bruno obeyed, and over the following week he sent Matteo photographs and detailed reports. Sienna Blake, 27 years old, living in a one-room apartment in the South Bronx, working 3 jobs, raising her child alone with help from an elderly neighbor named Margaret O'Brien. No man in her life, no family, no one except the child and the old woman. The child was named Leo, nearly 2 years old, healthy, lively, and with storm-gray eyes that struck Matteo like a blow to the chest in every photograph. But photographs could lie, light could create illusions, and Matteo needed certainty. He needed proof he couldn't deny before facing the truth he had been running from for 2 years. He called Dr. Henry Walsh, the Caruso family's private physician, who had handled countless sensitive matters over 30 years, and ordered a secret DNA test. Dr. Walsh took a sample from Matteo, and Bruno was tasked with obtaining a sample from the child, without Sienna discovering it. Bruno waited at the park where Sienna often took Leo on Sunday afternoons, and when the child dropped a small cloth he was carrying, Bruno picked it up instead of returning it, brought it to Dr. Walsh along with a few hairs caught in the fabric. A week later, the results came back, and Dr. Walsh stood in Matteo's office with the paper in his hand and the neutral expression of a man who had learned not to judge his employer. The probability of paternity is 99.9%, Dr. Walsh said. And Matteo held the paper, staring at numbers and scientific terms he didn't understand, but he understood, 99.9%. He understood that the child was his son, his blood, the heir of the Caruso line he had rejected and cast aside like trash. Dr. Walsh left in silence, and Matteo stood alone in the office with the paper in his hand. Then he let out a roar, not the sound of a man but of a wounded animal, and he began destroying everything within reach. A whiskey bottle smashed against the wall, the desk overturned, a chair hurled through the window, and when the rage finally burned out, Matteo Caruso collapsed to his knees amid the wreckage, clutching the crumpled DNA report, and for the first time in 20 years, the most ruthless mafia boss in New York cried. News in the criminal underworld spread like fire across dry grass, and within a single week after Matteo received the DNA results, rumors of Caruso's illegitimate child reached ears that should never have heard them. Angelo Ferretti, 45 years old, boss of the Ferretti family and Matteo Caruso's sworn enemy, sat in a dark room in Brooklyn listening to his men report, a venomous smile slowly forming on his lips. Angelo had waited 7 years for this moment. Ever since the night Matteo Caruso led the attack on his father's home and murdered him, along with Angelo's 2 brothers right before his eyes, leaving Angelo kneeling in his family's blood and swearing that one day he would have his revenge. For 7 years, Angelo rebuilt the Ferretti family from ashes, slowly and patiently, waiting for the moment Matteo Caruso would reveal a weakness. And now that moment had arrived in the form of a 2-year-old child with storm-gray eyes living in a decaying apartment in the South Bronx. Matteo Caruso, the ruthless man with no weaknesses, the man who built his empire by never letting anyone near his heart, now had a child, a chain that could bind him, a perfect hostage, a weapon Angelo could use to destroy his enemy from the inside. But Angelo didn't rush. He had learned from his father's failure that attacking Matteo Caruso head-on was suicide. He needed a flawless plan, and more importantly, he needed someone inside the Caruso family. And as if fate itself were smiling on him, that person came to him only 3 days later. Franco Caruso called Angelo late one night from an untraceable number, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and ambition, and proposed a secret meeting. They met in an abandoned warehouse in Queens at 2 a.m, Franco arriving alone without bodyguards, which told Angelo just how desperate Matteo's brother truly was. Franco said he had lived in his brother's shadow for 32 years, that he had given everything to the family and never been acknowledged, that Matteo had always treated him like a useless younger brother fit only to follow orders, And now that Matteo had an heir, Franco would never have a chance at the power he believed he deserved. Angelo listened in silence, studying the man before him, and saw the perfect traitor, someone willing to sell his own blood for power, a pawn that could be used and discarded when no longer needed. Franco offered a deal. He would provide information about the child and the mother, their routines and locations, the weaknesses in the security Matteo would inevitably put in place, and in return, when Matteo fell, Franco would gain control of the Bronx territory and be recognized as an equal ally of the Ferretti family. Angelo agreed, even though in his mind he was already planning Franco's death the moment he outlived his usefulness, because a man who could betray his own brother wouldn't hesitate to betray anyone else. That night, as Franco left the warehouse with a sense of victory, he had no idea he had just signed his own death sentence, while Angelo Ferretti remained in the darkness, mapping out every step of the kidnapping that would lead Matteo Caruso to his death and crown Angelo the king of New York's underworld. The conspiracy was set, the pieces were in place, and none of them knew that an innocent child with storm-gray eyes, sleeping peacefully in a small Bronx apartment, would become the center of a blood-soaked war whose outcome would change the fate of everyone involved. Sienna began to feel that something was wrong about 2 weeks earlier, a vague sensation like someone was watching her from the shadows, an invisible gaze pressing against the back of her neck whenever she stepped outside with Leo. She told herself she was being paranoid, that a hard life had made her suspicious, that there was no reason for anyone to follow a poor woman in the South Bronx. Yet the survival instinct she had sharpened through 27 years of fighting to stay alive kept whispering that something was coming. Then she started noticing the black sedan parked on the corner across from her building, a car that appeared in the morning when she left for work and was still there when she returned at night, with the shadow of someone sitting inside that she couldn't see clearly through the tinted windows. She told Maggie, and the elderly Irish woman frowned with concern and said maybe they should call the police. But Sienna knew the police wouldn't do anything about a car legally parked on a public street, and she also knew that if this was someone connected to Matteo Caruso, the police wouldn't dare touch it anyway. On the third night, she woke at 2 a.m. to a strange sound at the door, a soft click like someone trying to pick the lock, and her heart raced as she lay frozen on the bed, one arm wrapped tightly around Leo sleeping beside her, the other gripping the kitchen knife she had started hiding under her pillow the day before. The noise lasted about 2 minutes and then stopped, footsteps fading down the hallway, and Sienna lay there trembling until dawn, afraid to close her eyes, afraid to breathe too loudly, holding her son, and praying that the old door would be strong enough to protect them. The next morning, she examined the lock and saw fresh scratches in the metal, proof that someone had truly tried to break into her home, and she knew she couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. She thought about running, but where could she run with $80 in her pocket and a 2-year-old child? She thought about asking someone for help, but she had no one to ask, and in that moment of desperation, a name she despised flashed through her mind like a poisonous light. Matteo Caruso, the man who had thrown her away like trash, the man who had denied his own son, the man she had sworn she would never beg for anything. But this was no longer about her. This was about Leo, about her son's safety. And Sienna was willing to swallow her pride, willing to kneel, willing to do anything to protect the child she had carried for 9 months and raised with blood and tears for 2 years. She found the Caruso mansion number in a public directory, and at 2 a.m. the following night when the sound at the door returned, louder now, more urgent, as if the intruder had run out of patience, Sienna grabbed Leo and hid inside the closet, dialing the number with shaking hands. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered, and when she heard Bruno Vitelli's low voice asking who was calling, she whispered in desperation, "This is Sienna Blake. I need to speak to Matteo Caruso right now. Someone is trying to break into my home. Please. His son is here. Please." The line went silent for 1 second, then 2, and then Bruno said urgently, "Stay there. Don't hang up." And Sienna sat in the darkness of the cramped closet, holding Leo as he cried from being awakened, listening to someone trying to force the door outside, and praying that the man she hated most in the world would arrive before that door was broken down. 10 minutes. That was all the time Matteo Caruso needed to reach Sienna's apartment in the South Bronx. 10 minutes that felt like an entire century to her, as she crouched inside the closet, with Leo sobbing in her arms, and the sound of someone trying to break down the door, growing more violent by the second. Then suddenly the noise stopped, replaced by the sharp crack of gunfire, shouting, heavy footsteps running, and the familiar voice of Bruno Vitelli barking orders at someone. And then silence, a thick and terrifying silence. The apartment door was kicked open, and Sienna held her breath, clutching Leo so tightly the child whimpered in pain, until she heard that voice, the voice she hadn't heard in 2 years yet recognized instantly, as if it were carved into her bones. "Sienna, where are you? Come out. It's safe now." She opened the closet door with shaking hands and stepped out, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw Matteo Caruso standing in the middle of her miserable apartment, with 2 bodyguards and Bruno, a smoking gun still in his hand, looking at her with the same gray eyes she saw every day on her son's face. Matteo stood there, and in that moment he didn't look at her but around him, at the cracked walls with peeling paint, at the worn floor stained beyond cleaning, at the narrow single bed where she and Leo slept every night, at the cramped kitchen with its old battered utensils, and his face changed. Something between shock and pain, and guilt passing through his shadowed gaze like dark clouds crossing the sky. "This is where you live?" he asked in a low voice, and Sienna lifted her chin and looked at him with all the pride she still possessed after 2 years of hell. "This is where your son is growing up," she replied, stressing the words "your son" like a slap across the face of the man who had once denied his own flesh and blood. Matteo didn't answer. He stepped closer and looked at Leo for the first time from up close. The child had stopped crying and was staring at the strange man with wide, curious gray eyes, and Sienna saw Matteo inhale sharply, as if he had been punched in the chest. He saw himself in those eyes. She knew it. He saw undeniable proof that this child was his, and she wondered whether it made him feel anything at all, or whether the Mafia boss's heart had turned to stone long ago. "You need to leave here," Matteo said, his voice slipping back into its familiar, cold control. "I'll arrange a safe place, an apartment in Manhattan with guards 24 hours a day. You and the child won't lack anything." "No," Sienna answered immediately, and that blunt refusal made Matteo frown. "I don't need your charity," she continued, her voice trembling but firm. 2 years ago you threw me out with $100,000 and a threat to make me disappear. You called your own son something that needed to be dealt with. You don't get to walk in here now and tell me what to do." Matteo stood silent, and Sienna saw his jaw tighten, his temple twitch, the battle raging inside a man used to controlling everything, yet unable to control the thin woman holding a child in front of him. "I know," he said finally, and there was something different in his voice. Softer, almost tired. "I know what I did to you. I know you have every right to hate me, but this isn't about you and me anymore. This is about the child. Someone is trying to hurt him, and I can't let that happen." Sienna looked at him, searching for deception in his intense look but finding something she hadn't expected. Real concern, real fear. Not for himself, but for the child in her arms. "I can't change the past," Matteo continued, his voice dropping nearly to a whisper. "I can't give back the 2 years you survived alone. I don't even deserve to stand here. But I'm asking you, not ordering you, asking you to give me a chance to protect my son. It's the only thing I can do now." Sienna stood there in the broken apartment with her child in her arms, looking at the most powerful man in New York, speaking words that came close to an apology, with pain filling his gray eyes. And she remembered the man trying to break down her door minutes earlier, remembered the fear in Leo's eyes when he had been woken in the night. And she knew that no matter how much she hated Matteo Caruso, she couldn't let that hatred put her son in danger. "Fine," she said, the word falling from her lips heavy as stone. "I'll go, but not for you. For Leo. And you don't get to force me into anything. I'm not your servant anymore." Matteo nodded, and in that moment, under the dim yellow light of the cheap apartment, illuminating the faces of 2 people who had once shared a night and now shared a child, Sienna wondered whether this was the beginning of a new chapter, or simply the continuation of the nightmare she had been living for the past 2 years. The apartment Matteo arranged for Sienna was on the 12th floor of a luxury building on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a neighborhood someone like her would never have dared to dream of setting foot in if fate hadn't cruelly bound her life to that of New York's most powerful mafia boss. When Sienna stepped inside for the first time with Leo in her arms and Maggie following behind her, she froze in the doorway, unable to believe what she was seeing. The apartment was 5 times larger than anywhere she had ever lived, with polished oak floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a modern kitchen filled with appliances she didn't know how to use, 2 bedrooms with king-size beds and crisp white linens, and a separate room already prepared as a nursery, complete with a crib, toys, and animal murals someone had arranged before they arrived. "It's beautiful," Maggie whispered beside her. But Sienna felt no joy. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. The cage was stunning, but it was still a cage, and the man holding the key was Matteo Caruso. Bruno Vitelli stood by the door and explained the security. Guards stationed 24 hours a day in the lobby and on this floor. Cameras covering every angle, emergency alarm buttons in every room, and if she needed anything at all, she only had to call, and someone would respond immediately. Sienna listened in silence and wondered whether this was protection or confinement, whether she was being sheltered or simply becoming another possession of the Caruso family. Matteo arrived that evening to discuss their arrangement, and they sat across from each other in the living room like strangers, negotiating a business contract rather than two people who shared a child. "I want to see Leo," Matteo said bluntly. "Every week. Here, with you present. I won't take him anywhere, and I won't do anything without your consent." Sienna studied him, searching for hidden intent in those gray eyes, but she saw only waiting, a patience she hadn't believed this man capable of. "Fine," she said, "but on one condition. Maggie stays here with me. She's the only family Leo and I have, and I won't go anywhere without her." Matteo nodded without hesitation. "The apartment is large enough. She can have the second bedroom. I'll arrange it." Sienna was startled by how easily he agreed. She had braced herself for an argument, for refusal, for Matteo declaring it was his house and he decided who stayed, but instead he accepted it as if it were obvious. "As for money," Matteo continued, "you don't need to work anymore. I'll cover all expenses. You only need to focus on Leo." "No," Sienna shook her head. "I'll take care of myself. I'm not your family and I won't take your money. The rent and security are for Leo, not for me. Everything else, I'll earn myself." Matteo looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the corner of his mouth lift slightly, not in mockery but almost in admiration. Then he nodded, stubborn as ever. "Fine as you wish." After Matteo left, Maggie sat beside Sienna and took her hand. "My girl, I don't know what's happening between you and that man, but I know one thing. He looks at Leo like the child is his entire world, and a father who looks at his child that way can't be entirely evil." Sienna didn't answer. She turned to the window, gazing at Manhattan glittering below, and wondered whether she was stepping into a new life or falling into a trap lined with gold. The first meeting between Matteo and Leo in the new apartment took place on a Saturday afternoon, 1 week after Sienna moved in. And it was the afternoon when Sienna witnessed something she never believed she would see. The moment the most ruthless mafia boss in New York became completely helpless in front of a 2-year-old child. Matteo arrived exactly on time as agreed. Stepping into the apartment in a black suit, with a tense expression he tried to hide behind his familiar cold exterior. But Sienna noticed the anxiety in the way his hands clenched, and in how his eyes kept drifting toward Leo playing on the living room rug. Leo looked up at the sound of footsteps, and studied the strange man with wide, curious gray eyes. Not crying, not afraid. Simply observing as if instinct told him this person mattered, even though he didn't know why. Matteo stood there, staring at his son, and Sienna saw him swallow hard, saw his throat move, saw storm-gray eyes flicker with something she didn't dare name. "Do you want to hold him?" Sienna asked, surprised that her voice no longer carried the bitterness she expected, only a tired neutrality. Matteo nodded without speaking, and stepped forward, bending down and lifting Leo with the stiff, awkward hands of a man who had never held a child in his life. Everything went wrong immediately. Matteo held Leo as if he were holding a bomb that could explode at any second. Arms stretched away from his body, no support under the head or back, and Leo, sensing the unfamiliar tension, began to cry. It wasn't a gentle cry, but a panicked wail as if the child were being hurt. And Matteo stood there with the struggling toddler in his arms, his face drained of color, panicked, completely lost. A man who could order death without blinking, yet had no idea how to comfort a 2-year-old. Sienna watched for a moment, part of her wanting to let him suffer this helplessness as punishment for the 2 years she had endured alone. But Leo's cries tore at her, and she stepped in. "You have to support his head," she said, her voice still cool even as her hands reached for Matteo's arm to guide him. "Pull the child closer, let him feel safe, and talk to him. Your voice is too cold. Children need gentleness." Matteo obeyed like a disciplined student, drawing Leo against his chest, supporting his head with one hand. trying to speak, though his voice remained tight and rough. "Shh," he whispered clumsily. "Shh. Don't cry. I'm here. I won't let anyone hurt you." Leo's crying softened. The child stopped struggling and settled against his father, tear-soaked gray eyes gazing up at the man holding him. Then Leo did something no one expected. He lifted his small hand and touched Mateo's face, tiny fingers brushing over cheekbone, over the hard line of his jaw, over lips pressed tight, as if the child were trying to understand who this man was through the only language he knew. Sienna saw Mateo freeze, saw storm-gray eyes widen, saw something fracture behind that gaze like a fortress wall that had stood for years suddenly collapsing from the touch of a child's hand. "My son," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling and breaking. "My son." He pulled Leo tightly to his chest and closed his eyes, and Sienna saw a single tear slide down the cheek of the man she once believed had no heart. A tear he would deny if asked, but she had seen it, and she knew that in that moment, Mateo Caruso was no longer a mafia boss. He was simply a father holding his child for the first time, and realizing he had lost 2 years he would never get back. Maggie stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, wiping her eyes, and Sienna watched the man she hated cry over her son, unsure what she felt, only knowing that something was changing, slowly but surely, like ice melting under spring sunlight. Gianna Caruso came to visit Sienna's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the first meeting between Mateo and Leo, and her arrival completely caught Sienna off guard because there had been no warning, no request for permission. She simply stepped out of the elevator with 2 bodyguards behind her and knocked on the apartment door as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sienna opened the door and found herself facing the 62-year-old woman she had heard so much about but had never met. Gianna Caruso, widow of the former boss, mother of Mateo and Franco, the woman rumored to wield power equal to her sons within the Caruso family. Gianna was tall, her silver hair neatly pinned back, dressed in an elegant black dress, and wearing a strand of pearls Sienna guessed was worth an entire year of her wages. But what captured her attention most were Gianna's eyes. Not storm gray like Mateo's, but a sharp, intelligent dark brown. The eyes of someone who had seen far too much and understood human nature far too well. "I'm Gianna," she said, "and I've come to see my grandson. Do you mind?" It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't an order either. And Sienna stepped aside to let her in, not out of fear, but out of curiosity about what this woman wanted. Gianna entered the apartment with the ease of someone accustomed to walking into any space she chose, and when she saw Leo playing on the rug, she stopped, drew a slow breath, and Sienna saw those dark eyes soften. "He looks exactly like his father did as a child," Gianna whispered. Then she sat in the chair across from Leo and placed a large gift bag on the table. "Toys and clothes for my grandson," she said to Sienna. "I didn't know what he liked, so I bought many things." Sienna sat across from Gianna, while Maggie quietly retreated into the kitchen, and the 2 women studied each other in silence for a long moment before Gianna spoke again. "I know who you are," Gianna said plainly. "I know you were a maid in my house. I know what happened between you and Mateo, and I know how my son treated you." Sienna said nothing, her face unreadable, waiting for the judgment she assumed would come from a woman of such standing. But Gianna continued, "I didn't come here to judge you or to defend my son. Mateo was wrong, and I know that. I came because I wanted to meet my grandson, and because I wanted to speak to the woman who raised him alone for 2 years without giving up." Sienna was startled by that honesty and found herself asking, "Don't you think I'm a scammer trying to force my way into your family?" Gianna laughed, a dry laugh without cruelty. "I've lived long enough to tell the difference between a scammer and a desperate mother. And you're not a scammer. You're a woman my son hurt who still raised his child in circumstances many would have fled from. That deserves respect, not suspicion." Leo crawled over to Gianna's feet and looked up at her with wide gray eyes, and she bent down and lifted him naturally and gently, far more confidently than Mateo had the first time. "My grandson," Gianna whispered, "Caruso blood." Then she looked at Sienna. "But also your son. And I promise you I'll never try to take him from you. A child needs his mother, and you've proven yourself worthy of being his more than anyone." Sienna sat there watching the most powerful woman in the Caruso family hold her son and speak words she never expected to hear, and she felt something in her chest loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something she didn't dare name. 3 weeks after Gianna's visit, just as everything began to feel like it was settling into a fragile new rhythm, just as Sienna allowed herself to believe that maybe life wouldn't always be this cruel, The storm hit and tore away everything she thought she was finally holding on to. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon, warm sunshine and a clear blue sky, and Sienna took Leo to Central Park like she did every weekend, the 2 bodyguards Mateo assigned following at a distance, close enough to intervene, but far enough that she didn't feel suffocated, or at least that's what she believed. Leo ran across the green lawn chasing pigeons, his bright laughter ringing through the air, and Sienna sat on a stone bench watching him with a smile she didn't even realize she was wearing. One rare moment of peace in a life shaped by hardship. She had no idea that Franco had already sent a high-priority emergency signal to her guards, luring them away from their posts under the guise of a direct order from Mateo himself. Consequently, she didn't notice the bodyguards disappearing, didn't notice the black van parked at the edge of the park for the last 10 minutes, didn't notice the 4 men closing in from 4 different directions, because she was watching her son, soaking in the rare instant when she didn't have to think about money or danger or survival, only Leo's laughter. It happened too fast. So fast Sienna didn't even have time to react. A man appeared behind her and struck her head, the blow strong enough to knock her off the bench as the world spun and went dark at the edges, her ears ringing as she tried to push herself up, only for a kick to the stomach to fold her over, bile rising in her throat. "Leo!" she screamed, or thought she did, but only a weak, broken sound escaped her. And through blurred vision and pain, she saw what stopped her heart. 2 men were running toward Leo, who stood frozen on the grass, terror on his small face, and one of them scooped her son up like an object, Leo screaming as he was lifted, his cries ripping through the air, and she heard him call out, "Mommy, Mommy," and each word felt like a blade driven straight into her chest. Sienna tried to stand, tried to reach him, but the man who hit her grabbed her hair and yanked her backward, and she could only collapse to her knees on the cold ground, watching her child being carried away while she was powerless to stop it. Unable to protect the baby, she carried for 9 months and raised with blood and tears for 2 years. "Leo!" she screamed, this time the sound tearing free, raw and desperate, echoing through the park. "Give him back! Please, give my baby back!" But the kidnappers didn't slow. They threw Leo into the black van, and Sienna caught one last glimpse of her son's tear-soaked face through the window before the door slammed shut and the vehicle sped away, taking her only child, her only reason to live, her heart. The man released her hair and kicked her face down into the dirt, and before he walked away he leaned down and whispered coldly into her ear, "Compliments of Franco Caruso. He wants you to know this is the price for touching the Caruso family." Then he laughed and left her there, blood streaming from the wound on her head, her body in agony, but the physical pain meant nothing compared to the devastation in her chest, the pain of a mother whose child had been torn from her arms. She lay there screaming, the sounds no longer human but the cries of a wounded animal, as people in the park rushed toward her, someone calling 911, someone asking if she was okay, but Sienna heard nothing except Leo's voice echoing inside her head. "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy," and she knew that if anything happened to her son, she would never forgive herself, and she wouldn't let the people responsible go unpunished, whether it was Franco Caruso or anyone else. With shaking hands, she fumbled in her pocket, pulled out her phone, the screen cracked from the fall, and she dialed Mateo's number, and when he answered, she managed only one sentence before sobs swallowed her voice. "They took Leo? Franco and his people took your son." Mateo was sitting in his study at the Westchester estate when Sienna's call came through, and what he heard on the line froze the blood in his veins for a single heartbeat before it detonated into a fury no one in the Caruso family had ever witnessed. "They took Leo. Franco and his people took your son." Sienna's broken sobs echoed through the phone, and Mateo shot to his feet, the chair crashing backward onto the floor as a roar tore from his chest, a sound that wasn't human but animal, the howl of a beast whose child had been stolen, of a boss betrayed by his own blood. Bruno rushed in at the noise and found Mateo standing there with the phone still in his hand, his face drained to the color of a corpse, while his storm-gray eyes burned with a fire Bruno had never seen in 20 years of service. Not anger, but the raw rage of a father ready to burn the world down to get his child back. "Where is Franco?" Mateo asked, his voice glacial. And Bruno answered that he was downstairs, having arrived 10 minutes earlier and waiting to speak to him about something. Mateo said nothing more, pulled his gun from the desk drawer, and strode down the stairs with steps that thundered through the house. And when Franco looked up with his usual false smile, He didn't have time to react before Matteo lunged forward and smashed his fist into his brother's face with every ounce of fury boiling inside him. Franco hit the floor, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, and before he could rise, Matteo planted a boot on his chest and pressed the gun to his head. "You sold my son," Matteo roared, his voice shaking with rage. "You betrayed your own blood and sold your nephew to the enemy. Tell me where he is before I blow your head off right here." Franco tried to lie, tried to deny everything, claiming he didn't know what Matteo was talking about and had nothing to do with the kidnapping. But Matteo didn't have time for lies. He lowered the gun and fired into Franco's right knee, the shot deafening in the room, Franco's scream ripping through the air. "Talk," Matteo hissed, lifting the gun toward the other knee. "Next one goes in your head. You've got 3 seconds." Franco writhed on the floor in his own blood and finally broke, confessing everything, admitting he'd contacted Angelo Ferretti, revealing the plan to kidnap Leo to force Matteo's surrender, giving up the location where Ferretti was holding the child, an abandoned warehouse in the industrial part of Queens, where they'd planned it all a month earlier. Matteo stood over his brother and saw the face of the boy he'd protected since childhood, the brother he'd sacrificed for after their father died, the man he trusted with the family's most critical operations, and now that same brother had betrayed him, sold his nephew to an enemy, and put Matteo's son in mortal danger for power. He wanted to kill Franco right there, to end the betrayal with a single bullet, but his son was out there. Leo was scared and crying and waiting for his father, and every second wasted here was another second Leo suffered. "Lock him up," Matteo ordered Bruno. "If he tries to run, kill him. I'll deal with him later." Then he turned away and barked orders to mobilize every man in the family within 5 minutes. "We're going to get my son." 15 minutes later, a convoy of 6 black SUVs tore through New York toward Queens, Matteo riding in the front seat of the lead vehicle, his loaded gun steady in his hand, storm-gray eyes fixed ahead with the lethal focus of a predator tracking the one who stole what mattered most. He wasn't afraid to die. He wasn't afraid of Angelo Ferretti or anyone else. There was only one fear gnawing at him, the fear that he'd arrived too late, that when he opened that warehouse door, his son would no longer be breathing, and that fear ate at him like acid, turning him into something even more dangerous than a mafia boss, a desperate father with nothing left to lose. "Hold on, Leo," he whispered in his mind. "Dad's coming. I'm bringing you home, and anyone who touched you will pay in blood." The abandoned warehouse sat at the end of a dark alley in the Queens Industrial District, broken streetlights casting pockets of thick shadow, and when Matteo's convoy stopped 100 meters away, he could see silhouettes guarding the entrance. At least 5 men, maybe more inside, but the number didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that his son was in there. Matteo signaled his men to spread out and surround the building from every side, then led the main assault with Bruno at his shoulder, 2 men who had fought together for 20 years and understood each other without words. The first gunshot cracked when a guard spotted them, and from that moment hell erupted, muzzle flashes tearing through the darkness, gunfire roaring like thunder, screams of pain and bodies hitting the ground, blending into a deadly symphony. Matteo knew all too well. He fired without hesitation or mercy, every bullet leaving his gun carrying the rage of a father, and anyone who stood between him and his son fell one by one, blood staining the cold concrete floor. Bruno took a hit to the shoulder but kept fighting, covering Matteo as they pushed deeper inside, and when they kicked in the door to the central area of the warehouse, Matteo saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Leo was crying in Angelo Ferretti's arms, the child used as a living shield by his father's enemy, and Angelo had a gun pressed to the head of the 2-year-old, a mad smile on his face. "Stop, Caruso," Angelo screamed, "or I'll blow the kid's head off. You want to watch your son die right in front of you?" Matteo froze, gun still raised. Storm-gray eyes locked on the man who had killed his father 7 years earlier, the man who had sworn to destroy the Caruso family, and who now held his son like a bargaining chip. "Drop the gun," Angelo ordered, and Matteo slowly lowered it, but he didn't let go. He was calculating, watching, waiting for the moment he knew would come. Leo saw his father and cried out, "Daddy! Daddy!" the sound cutting through Matteo's chest like a knife, and the child struggled in Angelo's arms, reaching for his father, and in that instant, just one instant, when Angelo's attention faltered as he tried to control the squirming child, Matteo raised his gun and fired. One shot, a single shot, the bullet tearing through Angelo Ferretti's forehead and out the back of his skull, blood and bone splattering the wall behind him, as the Caruso family's sworn enemy collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his arms loosening around the child. Matteo lunged forward with a speed he didn't know he still possessed, catching Leo before the boy hit the ground, pulling his son into his chest with shaking hands as everything else disappeared. The remaining gunfire echoing somewhere in the warehouse no longer mattered. Angelo's body at his feet no longer mattered. There was only the child crying in his arms, only his son alive and safe. "Daddy's here," Matteo whispered, his voice breaking and unsteady. "Daddy's here now. No one can hurt you anymore. I won't let anyone ever hurt you again." Leo wrapped his arms around his father's neck, his face soaked with tears and snot, whispering hoarsely from crying so hard. "Daddy, I was scared. I was so scared." "I know," Matteo said, holding him tighter. "I know you were scared. But it's over now. Daddy's here. I'm taking you back to your mom." He stood with Leo in his arms, stepped over Angelo Ferretti's body without looking down, and walked out of the blood-soaked warehouse into the night. And for the first time in his life, Matteo Caruso prayed, not for himself, but that the small boy in his arms wouldn't be haunted by what he had seen tonight. 3 days after the rescue at the Queen's warehouse, Matteo Caruso summoned all the underbosses and power holders of the family to the Westchester estate, and when they entered the conference room where his father once ruled the empire, none of them knew that the world they understood was about to change forever. Matteo stood at the head of the table, his expression calm, but his gray eyes carrying something those who had followed him for years had never seen before. Not the familiar cruelty, not the cold authority of a boss, but the quiet certainty of a man who had made the most important decision of his life. "I'm stepping back," Matteo said, and the room fell into a dead silence as stunned eyes darted from face to face, no one daring to believe what they had just heard. Matteo raised a hand to stop the protests about to erupt, and continued in a voice that allowed no argument. "I'm not abandoning the family. I'm still a Caruso, but I don't want to run the operations anymore. Bruno Vitelli will take my place. He has the ability and the loyalty, and I trust him completely." Bruno stood at the side of the room with his arm still bandaged from the gunfight, and when Matteo spoke his name, he stepped forward, his face a mix of shock and unease. "Boss," Bruno said, "I don't deserve this." But Matteo shook his head. "You deserve it more than anyone. You've been at my side since we were kids. You've bled for this family, and I trust you to lead it the right way." The underbosses exchanged glances, some wanting to object, some wanting to ask why, but no one spoke. Because even if Matteo was stepping back, he was still Matteo Caruso, and one wrong word could still be a last word. The meeting ended in an atmosphere of tension and confusion, and when the room finally emptied, leaving only Matteo and Bruno, his loyal right hand asked what everyone wanted to know. "Why?" Bruno asked. "You built this empire with blood and tears. Why walk away from it now?" Matteo looked out the window at the manicured lawns of the estate he'd lived in all his life, and answered in a voice Bruno had never heard before, soft and almost tired. "Because 3 days ago, when I held my son in that blood-soaked warehouse, I realized something. I almost lost him, almost lost the only child I have, because of the world I built, the enemies I made, the power I chased my whole life." Matteo turned back to Bruno, and his storm-gray eyes were no longer cold, only honest in a way that stripped everything else away. "I can have all the power in this world," he said. "But if I lose Leo, if I lose the chance to be his father, what does any of it mean? I already missed the first 2 years of my son's life, because of my pride and my cowardice. I won't miss another day." Bruno stood there looking at the man he'd served for 20 years, the man he thought would never change, and he nodded slowly. "I understand," Bruno said, "and I promise I'll protect this family so you can protect yours." Matteo placed a hand on Bruno's shoulder, and for the first time in years, he smiled. A real smile. Not the cold curve of a boss, but the smile of a man at peace. "Thank you," Matteo said, and then he walked out of the conference room, away from the empire he'd built, and toward the Manhattan apartment where his son was waiting, the place he had chosen to call home instead of this grand but empty estate. Before his final departure, Matteo delivered a cold verdict on Franco, stripping him of the Caruso name and exiling him from New York forever, ensuring that the brother who sold his own blood would spend the rest of his life in shadow, forgotten and powerless. 1 week after Matteo announced his withdrawal from the underworld, when Leo had finally begun sleeping through the night again without nightmares of the kidnapping, Sienna decided it was time for her and Matteo to truly talk, Not the brief exchanges about Leo or security, but the conversation they had both avoided for far too long. She waited until Leo was asleep and Maggie had retreated to her room, then sat across from Mateo in the living room of the Manhattan apartment, soft yellow light washing over the faces of two people who had shared one night and one child, but had never truly shared the truth with each other. "You hurt me," Sienna began, her voice not raised, not trembling, just a fact, spoken after too many years of silence. "You used me and threw me away like trash. You called my son something to be handled. You sent me away when I had nothing, and you left me to survive 2 years of hell alone." Mateo sat and listened without interrupting, without defending himself, without trying to explain, taking every word like a blade he knew he deserved. "I slept in homeless shelters when I was 8 months pregnant," Sienna continued, her voice starting to shake, but she didn't stop. "I worked 3 jobs with a swollen belly until I collapsed. I gave birth alone in a public hospital with no one beside me except a kind old woman I'd just met. And every night when I looked into my son's eyes, I saw you, and I hated you. I hated you so much I could barely breathe." Mateo closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, Sienna saw his inherited silver orbs glistening. Not tears spilling over, but the dampness of pain barely contained. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Mateo said hoarsely, "because I know what I did doesn't deserve forgiveness. I was a coward. I was cruel. I denied my own son out of fear and arrogance, and no apology can erase the 2 years you were forced to endure." "Then what do you want?" Sienna asked, her voice sharp. "Do you want me to say everything's fine? That I've forgotten it all? That we can start over like none of it ever happened?" "No," Mateo shook his head. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm only asking for the chance to prove that I've changed. Not with words, because words are cheap, but with actions. Every day, one day at a time. Until you believe me, or until you tell me to stop." Sienna looked at him, searching for deception in those gray eyes, searching for the cold Mafia boss she had known. But all she saw was a tired man, asking not for forgiveness, but for the chance to atone. "I'm not promising to forgive you," Sienna finally said, "and I'm not promising to trust you. But for Leo, because our son needs a father, I'll give you that chance. But you only get one Mateo. If you disappoint me one more time, I'll take Leo and you'll never find us. I understand." Mateo nodded. "And thank you. Thank you for giving me more than I deserve." They sat in silence for a long time, two strangers bound together by a child and a painful past, and Sienna knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, that trust couldn't be built overnight, that wounds didn't heal with words alone. But for the first time since that fateful New Year's Eve, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the future wouldn't be as dark as the past. The months that followed passed like a dream Sienna barely dared to believe was real. Months in which she watched Mateo Caruso shed the image of a ruthless mafia boss and struggle instead to become an ordinary man, learning how to be a father and how to belong to a family. Mateo came to the apartment every day, no longer with bodyguards or luxury cars, coming alone in jeans and a simple shirt, as if he were deliberately peeling away layers of power so his son could see the man underneath. He learned how to play with Leo, sitting on the floor for hours stacking blocks, reading picture books in a voice that was stiff and awkward, and chasing the child through the apartment until they both collapsed onto the rug, laughing and breathless. One evening, Mateo announced he would cook dinner for the family, and Sienna and Maggie exchanged doubtful looks as the man who once ran a criminal empire stepped into the kitchen like a warrior entering a battle he'd never been trained for. The result was a disaster they would later laugh about. Rice burned black at the bottom of the pot, chicken so dry it could have passed for shoe leather, vegetables reduced to mush from being overcooked. Yet Mateo set everything on the table with the pride of a chef who believed he'd created a masterpiece, and Leo ate enthusiastically simply because his father had made it. Maggie quietly threw away the burned rice and ordered pizza, then winked at Sienna and whispered that at least he was trying, and that mattered more than the outcome. Evenings like that became routine. Mateo kept cooking despite failing more often than not, and Sienna began sitting beside him in the kitchen, teaching him how to cut onions without crying, how to season food properly, how to control the heat so rice wouldn't burn. And in those moments so ordinary they were almost trivial, she started to see a Mateo she'd never known, a man who could laugh at his mistakes, who could ask questions when he didn't know something, who could be gentle instead of always rigid. Then one afternoon, As Mateo sat on the sofa watching cartoons with Leo, the child suddenly turned, wrapped his arms around his father's neck, and said a word the whole room heard. "Daddy. I love Daddy." Sienna stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Mateo's face change, saw those storm-gray eyes widen then close, saw his arms tighten around Leo as if afraid the child would disappear if he let go, and she saw a tear slide down the cheek of the man she once believed had no heart. "I love you too," Mateo whispered, his voice breaking. "I love you so much, Leo." Maggie stood beside Sienna and took her hand. "Child," she murmured, "some men never change, but some just need a reason strong enough to change, and I think he's found that reason." Sienna didn't answer. She just stood there watching Mateo and Leo hold each other on the sofa, feeling something inside her begin to soften. Not forgiveness yet, not fully, but an acknowledgement that this man was truly trying, that he was giving up everything he used to be to become the father Leo needed. Late at night, after Leo was asleep, Sienna and Mateo began talking more about his past, about growing up inside a Mafia family, about his father's death and the weight of becoming a boss at 29, about the loneliness of having power without being truly loved. And Sienna began to understand, not forgive, but understand, that Mateo too was a wounded child, one who had never been taught how to love. And now at 36, he was learning the things he should have learned when he was young. 1 year later, on a summer afternoon when golden sunlight spilled across Central Park, Sienna sat on their familiar wooden bench, watching Mateo chase Leo across the lush green grass, the laughter of the 3-year-old ringing clear as wind chimes, and she rested a hand on her belly where another small life was growing, a second child who this time had been wanted from the very beginning and loved even before taking shape. Leo stumbled on the grass, and Mateo rushed forward, lifting him up, checking his knees, blowing softly on the scrape and kissing the child's forehead to soothe him, small gestures he hadn't known how to do a year earlier, and that had now become the instinct of a father. Maggie sat beside Sienna, her silver hair glinting in the sun, her blue eyes filled with affection as she watched the little family she'd become an inseparable part of. "Child," she said softly to Sienna, "who would have imagined that a year ago you were crying in a cramped Bronx apartment, and now you're here, with a family, with love, with a future." Sienna smiled and looked down at the engagement ring on her finger. The diamond, not overly large, but bright enough to catch the sunlight. The ring Mateo had placed on her hand one ordinary night in their apartment, not in a luxury restaurant or on a yacht as people might expect a billionaire to do, but in their kitchen after he'd cooked his first dinner without burning the rice. Mateo carried Leo back toward her, both of them sweaty with tousled hair, and when he sat beside Sienna, Leo climbed into his mother's lap and placed his tiny hand on her belly. "Baby," the 3-year-old said. "I want to play with the baby." Sienna kissed her son's head and looked at Mateo, and in those storm-gray eyes, she no longer saw the cold and ruthless Mafia boss. She saw a man transformed by love, a man who'd given up power for family, who'd learned to become someone he never thought he could be. Mateo took her hand and asked quietly, "Are you happy?" And Sienna nodded, for the first time in her life able to answer that question honestly. She looked out over Central Park at the Walkers and the other families at play and whispered the words she'd carried in her heart for 27 years. "We're not invisible anymore." Mateo squeezed her hand and repeated, "No, we're not invisible anymore, and we never will be." The story of Sienna and Mateo reminds us that no matter how painful the past may be, it doesn't have to define the future if we're brave enough to change. That forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wounds, but about choosing not to let them imprison the heart forever. And that true love can come from the most unexpected places and hold the power to transform even souls that seem turned to stone. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so we can bring you more moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Do you believe people can change when they have a reason strong enough? Share what's in your heart in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear your voice. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love from those you hold dear. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.